The Wyoming sun was a merciless thing, a blazing disk that scorched the plains and turned the air to a shimmering haze. Amos Kane, a cowboy whose life had been shaped by the endless rhythm of hoofbeats and the solitude of open country, rode his mare, Juniper, across the rolling hills. His face, lined and weathered by 40 years under that unforgiving sky, bore the marks of a man who had seen too much and said too little. His eyes, sharp as flint, scanned the horizon, not out of fear but from habit. A man didn't survive long in the frontier without knowing what was coming. His hat, stained with sweat and dust, sat low on his brow, and the revolver at his hip rested easy, a familiar weight. Amos was no stranger to trouble, but he wasn't looking for it either. Life, he learned, had a way of throwing it at you regardless. It was late afternoon when he spotted the homestead, a sagging relic of someone's failed dream nestled in a shallow valley. The house was little more than a skeleton of warped boards, its windows shattered, its roof half-caved. Amos had seen plenty like abandoned claims where hope had withered faster than the crops. He might have ridden past without a second thought, but the sound stopped him cold. A cry, faint and ragged, carried on the wind. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the bleat of a stray calf. It was human, and it was desperate. Amos reined in Juniper, his hand instinctively dropping to the grip of his revolver. The cry came again, weaker now, from the direction of a dilapidated shed behind the house. The structure leaned precariously, its wood bleached gray by years of sun and neglect. A heavy chain rattled when the wind stirred, and Amos's gut tightened. Something wasn't right. He swung down from the saddle, his boots crunching on the parched earth, and tethered Juniper to a splintered fence post. The mare snorted, sensing his unease, but stood steady as he approached the shed. The door was warped, barely hanging on its hinges, and secured with a rusted padlock and a coil of chain. Amos pressed his ear to the wood, listening. Inside, a child's sob broke the silence, followed by a low, trembling voice. "Please see broken bar, help us." The words were faint, but they hit Amos like a bullet. He didn't hesitate. Drawing his knife from its sheath, he wedged the blade into the lock. Seaman pried with the strength born of years wrangling cattle and breaking horses. The metal groaned, then snapped, and the chain fell away with a dull clatter. He yanked the door open, and the sight inside stopped his breath. In the dim, stifling confines of the shed, a woman sat slumped against the far wall. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, the skin beneath raw and bloodied. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, but they burned with a fierce, unbroken will. Around her, 4 children and none older than 10 were chained to iron stakes driven deep into the dirt floor. Their clothes were little more than rags, their faces smudged with dirt and streaked with dried tears. The youngest, a boy no more than 4, hurled against his mother's side, his small frame trembling. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and despair, and for a moment, Amos could only stare, his mind struggling to make sense of the cruelty before him. "What in God's name a broken bar?" he muttered, his voice rough as gravel. He knelt beside the woman, his knife already working at the ropes around her wrists. She flinched at his touch, her body tensing, but when her eyes met his, there was a flicker of something, a hope, maybe, or just the ghost of it. "They took everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My husband a broken bar, he's dead." "Bandits. They locked us here." "Been days." Amos's jaw clenched as he cut through the ropes, freeing her hands. They fell limp into her lap, and she rubbed at the raw skin, wincing. He moved to the children next, slicing through the ropes that bound their wrists and ankles. The chains clinked as they fell away, and the children shrank back, their eyes wide with fear and mistrust. The eldest, a girl with matted blonde hair, clutched her younger siblings protectively, her gaze fixed on Amos like he might turn on them at any moment. "Ain't here to hurt you," Amos said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Can you walk?" The woman nodded, though her movements were slow, unsteady. "I'm Clara," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "These are my children, Lily, Ben, Sarah, and Thomas." She gestured to each in turn. Lily, the eldest, with her wary eyes, Ben, a boy of about 8, thin but defiant, Sarah, maybe 6, with the tangle of dark curls, and Thomas, the youngest, who clung to his mother's skirt like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Amos sheathed his knife and scooped up Thomas, whose small body felt light as a bird's. The boy didn't resist, his head lolling against Amos's shoulder. Clara struggled to her feet, leaning on the wall for support, and the other children followed, clutching each other as they stepped into the fading light. The sun was dipping below the hills now, casting long shadows across the valley, and Amos felt the weight of their gazes on him. 5 souls, broken but alive, looking to him for what came next. "Come with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He led him to Juniper, who stood patiently by the fence post, and helped Clara and the children toward his camp a mile away. It was slow going. Clara's steps were halting, and the children were weak from hunger and confinement. Amos carried Thomas the whole way, the boy's small hands gripping his coat. Lily kept close to her mother, her eyes darting to the horizon as if expecting the bandits to come roaring back. Ben and Sarah walked hand in hand, their bare feet kicking up dust with every step. The camp was simple, a fire pit by a narrow creek with a bedroll and a small bundle of supplies. Amos settled Clara and the children on a patch of soft grass, wrapping them in his spare blankets. He stoked the fire, the flames casting a warm glow across their pale faces, and set a pot of water to boil. From his saddlebags, he pulled what remained of his provisions, a sack of beans, a few strips of dried beef, and a half-loaf of hardtack. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. He cooked the beans over the fire, slicing the beef into thin portions and softening the hardtack in the boiling water. The smell of food filled the air, and the children's eyes widened, their hunger plain. "Eat slow," Amos warned as he handed them tin plates. "Your stomachs ain't used to it." They tried to listen, but the children devoured their portions like they hadn't eaten in weeks, which, Clara confirmed, they hadn't. The bandits had raided their homestead 10 days ago, killed her husband, and taken everything of value: horses, tools, food. They locked Clara and the children in the shed as a cruel afterthought, a warning to anyone else who might cross their path. Clara spoke haltingly, her voice breaking when she mentioned her husband, but she held her children close, her hands steady despite her own weakness. Amos listened in silence, his eyes on the fire. He wasn't one for words, never had been. His life had been one of movement, driving cattle, breaking camp, running from one job to the next. He'd seen men die, seen towns rise and fall, seen the frontier chew up dreams and spit out bones. But these Clara and her children, chained like animals, stirred something in him, a quiet rage that burned hotter than the fire before him. He didn't know what he'd do with them, not yet, but he knew he couldn't leave them here. As the night deepened, the children grew drowsy, their bellies full for the first time in days. Amos rigged a tarp over a low branch to shield them from the chill, and they curled up together, their breathing soft and even. Clara sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of weak coffee Amos had brewed from the last of his grounds. She stared into the flames, her face a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. "You don't know us." "Don't owe us nothin'." Amos leaned back, his hat tipped low over his eyes. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night. "Seen too many folks left to rot out here," he said after a long pause. "Ain't right. You and those kids a broken bar. You deserve better." Clara's gaze softened, but she didn't reply. She sipped her coffee, and for a while, they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a night bird the only sounds. Amos didn't know what to make of the feeling in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He'd spent years alone, content with his own company, but something about Clara and her children, the way they clung to each other, the way Lily watched over her siblings, the way Thomas had trusted him enough to fall asleep in his arms, made him feel tethered, grounded in a way he hadn't been in years. The next morning, Amos woke before dawn, as was his habit. The camp was still, the children and Clara sleeping under the tarp. He checked on Juniper, then set about making breakfast with what little he had left. The beans were gone, but he had a few strips of jerky and some wild onions he'd foraged the day before. He boiled them into a thin stew, the smell rousing the children one by one. Lily was the first to sit up, rubbing her eyes and looking around as if she couldn't quite believe they were safe. "Morning," Amos said, handing her a bowl. She took it with a shy nod, then passed it to Ben, who was already awake and watching Amos with a mix of curiosity and caution. Clara emerged from the tarp, her movements stronger than the day before. She thanked Amos quietly and helped distribute the food, making sure each child got an equal share. Thomas, still clinging to her, ate with one hand while holding her skirt with the other. Amos watched them, his mind turning over what came next. He couldn't keep them here forever. His supplies were low, and the open country was no place for women and for children, not with bandits roaming the hills. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said as they finished eating. "Nearest town's Rock Creek, maybe 2 days' ride." "Got a sheriff there, maybe a doc." "You got family anywhere?" Clara shook her head. "My husband's people are back east, but we ain't heard from them in years. It was just us out here." Amos nodded, his jaw tight. Rock Creek it was. Then, he didn't know what they'd find. Ferry work was scarce, and a widow with 4 children wasn't exactly a welcome burden in a rough frontier town. But it was a start, and he'd see them through. Over the next 2 days, Amos kept them moving, though he set a slow pace to spare Clara and the children. He taught Ben how to cast a line in the creek, showing him how to spot the ripples where fish hid. Sarah, quiet but curious, watched as Amos mended a tear in his saddlebag, and he handed her the needle and thread, guiding her small hands through the stitches. Lily, still wary, stayed close to her mother but softened a little when Amos let her brush Juniper's coat. Thomas, too weak to walk far, rode with Amos, his small arms wrapped around the cowboy's waist as Juniper plodded along. Each night, they camped by the creek, and Amos stretched his supplies as far as they'd go. Clara helped, her strength returning with every meal. She was a farmer's wife, used to hard work, and she took to the camp chores with a quiet efficiency that Amos respected. She told him more about her life before the bandits, how they'd come west with dreams of a homestead, how her husband had built the house with his own hands, how the children had laughed and played in the fields before everything went wrong. Amos listened, saying little, but he felt the weight of her loss, and it stirred that same quiet rage in him. On the second night, as the children slept, Clara sat beside Amos by the fire. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes on the flames. "You're a good man, Amos Kane," she said softly. Not many would have stopped. Amos shifted, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what's right," he muttered. Clara's hand brushed his, and for the first time in years, Amos didn't pull away. Her touch was warm, steady, and it sent a jolt through him, like a spark catching dry grass. He didn't know what to make of it, didn't know what to do with the feeling that had been growing since he'd found them in that shed. All he knew was that these 5 souls, Clara, Lily, Ben, Sarah, and Tomasa, had become his responsibility, whether he'd asked for it or not. The next morning, as they packed up camp, Lily approached Amos, holding something small in her hand. It was a smooth river stone, polished by the creek's current. "Found it by the water," she said, her voice hesitant. "Thought you might like it." Amos took the stone, turning it over in his calloused fingers. It was a small thing, insignificant to most, but to him, it was a gesture. A crack in the wall Lily had built around herself. He slipped it into his pocket and nodded. "Thanks, Lily." She gave him a shy smile, then ran back to her siblings. Amos watched her go, his chest tight. He didn't know what lay ahead, whether Rock Creek would offer refuge, whether the bandits would come looking, whether Clara and her children would find a place to start over. But as he mounted Juniper and led them toward the town, he felt a certainty he hadn't known in years. They weren't alone anymore, and neither was he.